My name is Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, Chair of the Research in Historical Trauma and Transformation at Stellenbosch University. We are hosting the event with Tracy Webster, the CEO of the Oppenheimer Trust. We are live from the Johannesburg-based Brantus Library for Brantus Africana Library. It's a historic library in Johannesburg. It's a beautiful spot for the audience who's live with us today. They are witnessing the beauty of this wonderful library. Welcome to all of you who are from home, zooming in from your homes. We are in conversation this evening with two very special friends and colleagues. I'll introduce them shortly, but first for some housekeeping issues. We're going to have a conversation starting with some remarks by myself, followed by Professor Homi Bhabha, and then ending with Professor Sylvia Vollenhoven. And in between, we will have conversation, three-way, two-way conversations. About 25 minutes before the end of the evening, we're going to invite questions which you can already post in the course of the conversation. We're going to invite questions from the virtual audience. And at some point, we'll open it to you, the audience that is present with us this evening in South Africa, and where Homi is, it's daytime. So we are delighted to be here with you, and this event is a prelude to an awards ceremony tomorrow, the Harry Oppenheimer Fellowship Award, which is happening tomorrow. You will hear more about that perhaps in the course of time. But for now, I want to open with my remarks. There's a history to this event today, and the title of which is The Creative Force of the Imaginaries for Reparative Humanism. And both Homi and Sylvia are friends and colleagues with whom I have been in conversation with over time. Homi more than Sylvia, but since meeting Sylvia, it's almost as if I have known her forever. I've known her work. So I will start with introducing Sylvia. She is the University of Johannesburg's first ever professor of practice, an award-winning journalist, playwright, filmmaker, writer, and Knight Fellow. Sylvia, you've got to tell us at some point what is Knight Fellow. What does that mean? Her book about Khoisan identity, The Keeper of the Kum, won the Mbokodo Award for Literature, which is a very prestigious award. And I'm very delighted to know that I was at the launch of your book, I think about 5 years ago. Her dance drama adaptation of the book was showcased on the main program at the 2016 South African National Arts Festival. She was nominated for the 2016 South African National Arts Festival. She was nominated as well for the 2016 South African Film and TV Awards for Best Director and Best Documentary. Her play, Cold Case, Revisiting Dulcie September, won both the inaugural Adelaide Tambo Award for Human Rights in the Arts and the Standard Bank Audience Award. A play she co-authored, My Word, Redesigning Buckingham Palace, was chosen for a run on London's West End. This doesn't mention that the play also ran in South Africa at the Artscape, and I was privileged to watch the play at the launch of the play at the Artscape, which is one of the main theaters in Cape Town, South Africa. And we're delighted also that in the audience today, the person who played the role in this, the main character, in a one-person play actually, Basil Cupido is with us and co-wrote the play with Sylvia. So wonderful all around, all of these presences of you all. Now, I want to introduce Homi. Homi is a very special friend. He's the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of English and American Literature and Languages at Harvard University, one of the most important figures in contemporary post-colonial studies. Homi is the author of numerous works exploring post-colonial theory, cultural change and power, contemporary art, and cosmopolitanism, including Nation and Narration and Location of Culture, all which are famous texts of Homi's. A fellow of the British Academy, his honors include the Padma Bhushan Award, which is a prestigious award from the Republic of India that recognizes outstanding contribution in literature and education, the Humboldt Research Prize, and honorary degrees from University Paris 8, University College London, the Free University Berlin, and our own university in Stellenbosch, who awarded Homi the honorary doctorate about 3 years ago, I think it was. So it's a wonderful privilege to have both of you, Homi and Sylvia. I look forward to the conversation with you later this evening. The topic today, as I had stated, is the creative force of the imaginaries for reparative humanism. This topic was conceived as a conversation on the role of the arts, stories and storytelling through literature and performance arts as reparative practice in response to the repetition of traumatic histories. The topic seeks to ask, in the aftermath of trauma and in the face of transgenerational transmission of traumatic histories, how might the arts support an ethical commitment to an irreparable past? In a way, the idea for this discussion on the question of the emergence of ethical possibilities through art's creative force was conceived as the sequel to a discussion that was hosted by the Rector and Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, Professor Wim de Villiers, for the Stellenbosch University's annual Africa Day lecture, which was held in May. For that event, titled Remaining Human, Dignity and Repair in the Face of Trauma and Violence, I was in conversation with 3 inspiring women scholars. First, Tsitsi Dangarembga, the multi-award-winning author of This Mournable Body. Tsitsi was scheduled to be on this panel actually before this event had to be postponed, a sign of the times we live in, and the new date unfortunately coincided with the Frankfurt Book Festival taking place this week. Now, the second person on this foundational panel for today's conversation was Tamar Gab, acclaimed art historian and a close collaborator based at University College London, whose work interweaves political, visual, and personal histories with curatorial projects that have included post-apartheid culture and arts. And finally, Sheena O'Connell, a leading scholar, practitioner in our own shores from University of Pretoria, whose filmic and curatorial work seeks to open up questions around freedom, trauma, and memory, the life of the racially oppressed South Africa. I think it was important to give this background to the foundational background to this talk. And this will soon become apparent why. Tsitsi Dangarembga at that event led with a keynote which I want to refer to as the starting point that provides a framework for my remarks. Let me also mention at the onset that I considered Tsitsi's book, Mournable Body, the final in her trilogy written over almost a 30-year period, to be a profound example of the intersection of the historical and the psychological with a literary imagination to portray in such a powerful way how growing up in a racist, colonial, an apartheid system so often leads to such traumatic repercussions to the point of destruction of the very definition of personhood. At one point, towards the end of the book, the main character, Tambudzai, in a moment of quiet witness, seemingly taking stock of her life and that of the women in her family who have fought 3 Zimbabwean wars of liberation, reflects on the violence that her aunts have not been able to run away from in contemporary Zimbabwe. It is a violence that, quote, leaps from the bowels onto their tongues, again and again, close quotes. Yet, at the end of the book, the end of Tambudzai's traumatic trajectory, Dangaremga points us to the possibility of repair. In a keynote at the Africa Day event I've mentioned, Dangaremga returned to this theme of the possibility of remaining human in the face of trauma. We can draw on the African idiom of what it means to be human, she said, as well as on the new knowledge to reactivate dignity. In these brief remarks then, I want to argue with Dangaremga that the transgenerational consequences of historical trauma, such as apartheid, colonialism, and the racism linked to these, can and should open up moments that lead us back to our knowledge of what it means to be human. In our quest for restoration and repair, in the face of a traumatic future that has become the past, the cultural idioms that imbue our history with the value of Ubuntu can be important sources of hope. A reminder that being human is bound up with the social and acting in solidarity with the other. Umntu, ngumntu, ngabanye abantu. Apartheid and colonialism destroyed but did not obliterate this important value. Apartheid was based on the negation of the subjectivity of the other. In contrast, the foundational philosophy of Ubuntu teaches us that a person is a person through being witnessed by and engaging in reciprocal witnessing of other persons, seeing the other's humanity, or a person becomes a human being through the multiplicity of relationships with others. As a process poised to imagine a new future in South Africa after apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tried to recapture this value. It tried to open a path to reconnect with these values enshrined in our concept of what it means to be human. Along with significant hopeful moments revealed at the TRC, that vision, the vision in other words, to reconnect with this very important value of what it means to be human, a value that defines our humanity, this vision was interrupted at the same time by stories that showed that the crimes committed during apartheid, the mutilation and dismembering of bodies, burning of remains, torture, massacres, all these were a bridge too far. It may well be that for many perpetrators, beneficiaries, and others implicated in these crimes, the perversion of morality associated with these crimes is a traumatic shame that continues to threaten their descent into a vortex of inhumanity. I think that as trauma, shame, with all its dynamics that include hiding from the self, may lie at the roots of racism. And this forecloses any possibility of seeing the other as human. There is also the problem of the tendency to rely exclusively, in other words, besides this fact of the problem of not seeing the face of the other, blocked by the culture of racism, at the TRC, as well as in general in our conversations, there is also the problem of in our scholarly conversations, there's a problem of the tendency to rely exclusively on psychoanalytic tropes, on the psychoanalytic lens in thinking about trauma, its transgenerational repetitions, and how we approach notions of its repair. The repeated reference to the traumatic as the unrepresentable blinds us to the persistent cries of victims who want to convey to us the precise nature of the traumatic memory that plagues them long after the encounter with a traumatic experience. The tendency to rely on narrative as the vehicle for healing trauma is another limitation of the view that defines trauma as, quote, a failure of language, unquote. Theoretical preference for verbal narrativizing of traumatic experience limits what may be ethical opportunities for engaging with trauma's repair through forging human connection. An exception among these limitations of psychoanalytic thinking is the Kleinian object relations theory, which offers a useful framework for understanding the capacity for production of ethical subjects in the aftermath of trauma. In other words, Melanie Klein and object relations theory argues that trauma, or rather violence, or inflicting violence on another person tends to force the person who perpetrates the violence, whether in real or in the imaginary, in other words, whether it is a fantasy or real, because sometimes we think we've hurt others when actually we haven't, but it is in fantasy that we think we have hurt them. Now, Melanie Klein argues that often this is a provocation for a return to a much more empathic connection with the person we have hurt in order to right that wrong. The transformation of violence into a quest for empathic engagement is an ethical opportunity that remains open, what in Kleinian terms is referred to as making reparations in order to repair, to make good, in other words, the damage inflicted on the objects. I raise it here and I think about this in my work in parallel with the ideas of Ubuntu as that place where we arrive at when we have an openness and a readiness to engage in a manner that is much more invitational rather than exclusivist. The idea of making reparations entails reconstituting the human gaze and looking at the other in a way that recognizes their subjectivity as part of the human community, what Martin Luther King Jr. referred to as allowing oneself to be, quote, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Archbishop Tutu actually said something similar about Ubuntu. He said it's being caught up in an inextricable relationship that connects us to another. So this idea of being caught in an inescapable network of mutuality captures the idea of, this mutual, this sort of reciprocal mutual engagement that we arrive at through the experience of Ubuntu, or through the experience of a real sense of empathic connection with another. And this is the contribution that the arts can make. In other words, the arts can inspire this sensibility, this empathic sensibility, and engendering of reparative practices. Now, I want to think now about the moments, the time, the situations where the language of psychoanalysis has limitations and where we are called upon to look at traumatic experiences or to look at other signs of expressions or at other modes of expression of trauma, so that we are not just limited to language in terms of waiting to hear what traumatic experiences are, or waiting for people to articulate through language what the traumatic experience was. And so I want to map experience here that shows us that sometimes trauma cannot even, the language of trauma cannot be accessed, not only because trauma, the language is not accessible, but because the trauma itself, the origin of the occurrence of trauma was itself not accessible. I'm approaching the end of my presentation, and so I want to continue with this reference that I'm talking about, the family reference. So for families that have not found their loved ones' remains in the aftermath of violent political repression, where people are disappeared or killed and buried in secret graves, it is particularly difficult to situate the loss in the past, to construct narrative memory as psychoanalysis demands, and to accept its finality. When what happened remains intangible and elusive, the process of working through and integrating the trauma-inducing experience is deferred, and instead it is replaced by a haunting and unfillable chasm of sorrow. This is not only because the crushing quality of the unfinished business of trauma and loss, but especially because of the void created by the impossibility of memory. Firstly, the traumatic memory emerges from an absence, from an encounter that was registered as a traumatic absence in the first place. Secondly, being unable to confirm the loss may lead to the repudiation of its reality. A void separates the possibility of knowing from not knowing, suspending victims in the disabling structure of an unbridgeable past between the problematic and its representation and efforts to resolve it. The desperation to know in order for the living to lay to rest those who have departed has sometimes been so great that it is difficult to work through and to engage with the idea of working through. This is where the role of the arts comes in as an important example. Now, the link between the role of the arts and what you are referring to as this reconnection with the possibilities, with the ethical possibility of an Ubuntu, ethos of an Ubuntu, becomes very important when we're thinking about the role of the arts. And this is where I want to end my remarks here by pointing out simply that what the hope is with the arts, and both Homi and Sylvia will share with us their own experiences, their own thoughts and reflections on this. But what is important is that the arts present a possibility, an opportunity for us to relate to these experiences, not necessarily through language. It's a different kind of language, but one that inspires all our sensibilities. When you are witnessing a performance or a presentation of art, it invites all your sensibilities, not just the mind, not just the sound of what is being said, or not just the you know, the actions of what are being performed in front of you, relating to the actions. It's all of these. It's an imaginary. It invites an imaginary that goes beyond all the senses. And this is why the arts is important. And this is why in the course of the arts, the inspiration towards connecting with the other, which I define here in part as part of what the ethics of Ubuntu does for us and what it stands for, is really the importance is that this is a contribution that invites a new way of thinking about our future. We are at the future that the TRC imagined when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established. But now we realize that the reconciliation that was envisioned has not actually come to being. We've got to have new imaginaries. And going back to what we understand about what it means to be human seems to me is another important available way for us to engage with in order to imagine a new future now, so that as we move forward to the future, we do not have a reproduction of this future that has been reproduced from a past that we thought we were leaving behind. Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Homi now to respond. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Homi. I welcome you again very warmly, and we are looking forward to your remarks. Over to you, Homi.
Well,
I have to tell you there
thank
is a note that there is a great attendance online. So I know I'm not supposed to tell you, but I am telling you anyway. So, Homi.
Well, thank you very much, Pumla, for inviting me to celebrate with you this remarkable achievement of yours.
Homi. The live audience at least can't hear Homi. I don't know about the virtual audience.
Well, they've got to
wonderful. There you go. Excellent. You are on. We can hear you.
Can you hear me now? I keep getting an echo, which I've been complaining about right from the start. But I think it may have died down now. Anyway, enough of technology. Let's get to the heart of the matter. Pumla, there could be few things that make me as profoundly joyful as this Oppenheimer recognition. To you for your work both at the scholarly level, but for your work at the level of social ethics and the political future. You've done a huge amount to inspire us to change the present by projecting us into a future, by making us divide ourselves in a way in which we have to throw ourselves into a future, a proleptic future, which actually returns our gaze to us in the present as individuals and communities. This is, in a way, the imaginary that you talk about, the imaginary of literature, the imaginary of art, the imaginary of dance. It's to pause the moment in real time, while at the same time to throw you as a witness or an audience into a more virtual future of witnessing, where you are not yourself necessarily always implicated, but you are always ethically responsible, and you look back at yourself and say, what is it that I do now? What is it that I should have done now? So I think that what I'm calling this theatrical or proleptic future, the future of the virtual, is extraordinarily important. One of the problems with the digital world in which we live is that it is so presentist. people will send out a Twitter or write a blog immediately and expect an immediate response. That does not give us the time to make this imaginative leap into the future, this reflective leap, and come back and examine ourselves through it and say, I should do this or I should do that. Now, I am responding to your talk just as I heard it, so please excuse any misunderstandings or any incoherencies on my part, because I'm, as it were, responding off the top of my head. If I had read it before, I could respond from the middle of my voice, from the top of my head, and the tip of my tongue. So I ask you all for your generosity. I want to start, having talked about this notion of the imaginary as a form of ethical time that projects into the forward to interrogate the present, what I call proleptic. I want to think for a moment about the term reparative humanism. A reparative humanism demands, I think, as Frantz Fanon said, that we have to take apart the humanisms that we have inherited. A humanism which was capable of the Holocaust, a humanism which was capable of apartheid, a humanism which was capable of ridding the Palestinians of their own lands, a humanism that was responsible, despite its rhetoric, of 2 world wars, of contemporary refugees. After all, the refugee crisis was, the response to it was seen as a humanistic crisis, as a humanistic response. But let us be clear that whenever we have these political crises, humanism always comes afterwards. Before the crises happen, when people were being warned of it, there ain't no humanistic policies. There are only rational choice, profit-based policy issues, often very nationalist. So let me suggest that we need to rethink humanism. And Levinas himself once said, we have to think the notion of humanism against humanism itself. So that's one of my first issues about humanism. Then, my dear Pumla, you talked consistently about being able, as part of this reparative humanism, to recognize the humanity of our neighbors, and even indeed the humanities of those who are our adversaries, not just are part of our solidarity, but those who have put us in the violence and victimage. And you have suggested that we need to extend this sense of the human in order to be able to repair the traumatic. I want to depart a little here on the basis of work I've currently been doing to suggest in resonance with you that I make a distinction, which you may or may not want to accept, that we are all born as human. The notion of being born human is part of the foundation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And despite all the countries that have adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it has never stopped them from treating minorities, racialized people, sexually diverse people with violence and in inhuman ways. The recognition of the human has actually, and you might say, well, this is a perversion of the human, but I'm just saying with a kind of historical sorrow and sobriety, that the idea that we're all born human has in the 20th and 21st century been continually denied and even despised. So what I'm suggesting is, of course, we're all human. But I've recently written that we're all human, we're born human, but we have to be taught to be humane, what you've called the empathetic. Being born human for countries and constitutions and conventions to repeat again and again that we're all human is now, to me, a rather perverse kind of symptom of the neglect that we are indeed all human. And where I say we have to be taught to be humane, I am suggesting that projects such as yours on trauma and violence and reparative humanism, although I put humanism in inverted commas, maybe a little bit more than you do, these are forms of teaching to be humane. We are taught to be humane in the university, where, for instance, the subjects of the humanities are now being drastically destroyed and cut across the world. We are taught to be humane when we join political parties that have mutual interest in their minds, that want to establish a commonality, or at least a convergence of ideals and ethics. Not political parties who will do anything they need to do to be in power and then maldistribute that power, so those who have voted for them through a democratic process are then thrust aside, their conditions becoming worse and worse. We need a politics which teaches us to be humane, not a politics which fetishizes power, and by fetishizing power, encourages corruption and anti-democratic thinking through the democratic process of voting. We need to be taught to be humane through our courts, our law courts. I've talked about the university. I've talked about the political system. We need to be taught to be humane. I won't continue, but I'm happy to do so. And being taught to be humane is different from being taught to be recognized as human. Because the notion of the humane introduces various practices of education, practices of cohabitation, practices of conversation, of dialogue. So I'm suggesting that we add to the concept of the humane. We say we are born human, but we have to be taught to be humane. This is a human practice of civility which makes you humane. Ubuntu, I think, from my superficial understanding, would acknowledge the distinction I'm trying to make between the repetition of being human and the education of being humane. And this is a very difficult issue, because those who we depersonalize or dehumanize, we don't simply erase them from our consciousness. We use, if we want to humiliate, if we want to depersonalize, power, racialized power, places subjects of race, subjects of race, subjects that articulate their own gender or sexual differences, subjects of political and social disadvantage, the poor. These figures are never simply erased. And when we say they're marginalized, I think that metaphor might need some revision, because all forms of racialism takes its victim, does not simply erase that victim, but gives that victim a certain visibility, a visibility of criminality, or a visibility of incivility, or of violence. It always makes the object of discrimination both visible and therefore attributes to the subject, the oppressed subject, the reasons for his or her humiliation, the reasons for his or her not being the beneficiary of rights or representations or reparations, or indeed financial and legal support. So in a way, when we erase a subject, we always keep a little bit of that subject in our eye, the corner of the eye, so that one can always, like a smote in the eye, you know, which you rub all the time. You always have to have that form of that negative visibility in order to attribute those who suffer the reason for their suffering. And so I'm suggesting that when we want to reconstitute the face of the other, we have an additional problem of not only constituting the face of the other in itself, but the face of the other in the discriminatory racial eye of power that has kept this smoke, kept this little piece of grain of sand in their eye. We have to wash the eyes of those who have perpetrated the racial. I want to now, of course, come to the end of my comments by suggesting to you that the nature of therapy, psychotherapy, or psychoanalysis, which you talked about as being very dependent on narrative and on language. And I want to talk about that distinction between therapy and theatricality, with which you ended. And I want to suggest to you, my dearest Pumla, that there may be more things in common between them than are allowed, because at the heart of what Freud called the talking cure, of course, that's both metaphorical and actually literally true, because the idea is to allow the therapist to create the conditions whereby the traumatized individual has free reign, a freedom of speech, a freedom of self-interpretation, and slowly through that process becomes a witness to himself or herself. So the act of the therapist is more the act of the doctor or what do I mean to say, the person who allows the child to be born and is there simply to create the conditions of that new birth of the subject. So it seems to me that just as we learn from theatricality, because in the theater there is always a triangle. There is what is going on the stage, which is itself a witness to a history or to a character's tragedy or to a character's comedy. So there is that notion of a performance on the stage. And then the second part of the triangle, the second side of it, is the identification with the audience as witness at one remove. And then the third part of the triangle is the larger world in which bit by bit, angle by angle, not always in the same way, but through processes or identifications or identities of difference, we relate. So in building that triangularity, we begin to understand how to see the face of the other in ourselves. And I believe that at its best, that is what therapy does through the encouragement of associative free speech, that as you speak with the therapist as a witness, through your own traumatic experience of which you cannot make sentences. Sometimes it's a physical movement. There is a language of the body. as indeed in the theater, there is always a language of the body that accompanies the theatrical or dramatic process. In the same way, in the therapeutic condition, there is a language of silence. There is the language of making illogical connections, going from one place to another. But all that is part of the therapy of working through bit by bit over time, taking the traumatic, and you never can know the cause of the traumatic, not because it doesn't have a cause. You never know the cause of the traumatic because it is continually being displaced through your life in different ways. You may have been the subject of huge violence as a child. Now, that violence that you suffered can over time turn into a sense of lack of self-confidence in your work. It can then displace itself in your own family life, and so on and so forth. So I'm suggesting that a form of narrative which allows one to be the agent and the witness at the same time is essential, both for reconstituting what I've described as the humane which thinks about mutuality by meditating on the fact that one is never free of the tension of being both an agent in the world and a witness to oneself and to others. And it is from that split in the self, which none of us can ever resolve, but we always feel it, and it is in our words and in our actions that we can create a sense of the dignity of the other as a work, as a production of one's own sense of empathy. Thank you very much.
For these remarks, and there is so much. I'm warned that we're running out of time, but I do want to mention one thing, which is that your distinction between the humane and the human is something I absolutely embrace. I absolutely embrace. I think it's critical, particularly because the notion of what it is to be a person or a human under apartheid conditions has always been one that distinguishes between who are the human and who are the persons considered persons. And so the teaching of this, understanding, returning people to the idea of what does it mean to be humane, never mind human, is really a very important observation. And I have to stop, but there's so much, your idea of the proleptic future, placing ourselves, taking ourselves, projecting ourselves into the future and imagining what is our life going to be when it comes to that future. And so making decisions to act now is fascinating. I think it's really a powerful and profoundly important notion, thinking about what can we do, how can we act now in order to have a particular kind of future. I think that those two will just be the comments that I send back at you, but we'll engage more when you come to South Africa and in February. So I look very much forward to continuing the conversations with you, Homi. Thank you very much. Sylvia, it's such an honor to be sitting next to you this evening. I have always wanted, you saw on my email, I've followed you since that launch of your book, never really had an actual moment to sit next to you, and that you so graciously opened yourself to receive me was really wonderful, and that you agreed to come to be in conversation with Homi and me today is a real blessing. So thank you, and I want to open the floor, give the floor to you for the taking. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Pumla, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I would just like to start by saying, Kite says, greetings. I begin by paying respects to the First Nations, custodians of this land, and by acknowledging that this event is being held on the traditional lands of the indigenous peoples of Southern Africa, the Khoi and the San nations. I also pay my respects to my elders, past, present, and future, and to our ancient cultures and ongoing connections with land, sea, and community. If Africa is the birthplace of humanity, then we are all children of the sun, Geit says. So today I'd like to start by focusing just very briefly on some of the work that I do around trauma, healing, and creativity, and how it relates to reparative humanism that Homi has so eloquently placed in a wonderful context for us. All storytelling starts with writing, and writing in my background has been for journalism, for the stage, for theater, for filmmaking, and a wide range of platforms. But my entry point into all of my writing is the prism of the personal. I deal in the book that I've written, The Keeper of the Kum, with ancestral voices, identity, and healing. If you could please go to the next slide, thank you. In this book, The Keeper of the Kum, having dealt with strange things that as an urban, fairly cynical journalist did not come to me very easily, I learned that the huge and important connection between personal illness that I was going through and collective trauma that we have been talking about this evening. And also I learned how rational and as well as intuitive exploration of the past is necessary side by side. Next slide. On this journey of writing, I came across an ancestral character called Bhabha. Bhabha is a 19th century visionary who got my attention with a strange illness. I had to learn to accept that a physical illness in the 21st century is connected to events of hundreds of years ago. And rising above my intellect, I embarked on a journey that led to healing. And I told the story for only one reason. I have absolutely had no other option. So research and intuition, how do we put those two things together? Next slide. I have been part of a group of indigenous women who recently published a book called Rethinking Africa. And for me, this book was a kind of TRC of the soul. I write the opening chapter in the book called Writing Ourselves into History, the Liberating Narrative of Who We Are. And this opening chapter is written from the perspective of a storyteller who has gone in search of a healthier way of positioning both myself and my people in the landscape of our history. Now, for me, storytelling has so many different aspects. There's storytelling, there's story taking, but most importantly, there's story sharing. And when it comes to story sharing, I have, as I said, written a novel, but I find that particular way of storytelling, especially in the African context, is very limited. It can be considered quite elitist. But it is, of all the types of storytelling that I do, the most cathartic. By comparison, my work in the theater and film has a much wider outreach, much wider reach, obviously. And on those platforms, I find the interplay of author, myself as the writer, the filmmaker, the creative, is so much more dynamic. The interplay between the author, the characters, and the medium, the possibilities are so much more endless, and especially in the 21st century, with all of the technology at our disposal, it is a hugely exciting world to be in as a storyteller. But one of the most important things, and that we also especially discovered with the play Kritoa that we staged both in the Netherlands, because it's a collaboration between Holland and South Africa, and in South Africa, is how well film and theater, and in this case, theater, can cross borders. And if we have time, we can talk more about that later on. But rounding up, I wish to say that the body of work that I'm responsible for weaves connections between from one book to the next, it is important for me how the connection between a play that I've written on a South African author called Richard Reeve, another play on an ANC activist called Dulcie September, and a film about rooibos, or a uniquely South African tea that touches on traditional knowledge of the indigenous people of South Africa. The underlying connection of all of that work is very, very clear. And that underlying connection is like an ancestral calling, and it is to restore my people to the landscape of our history. A more recent work that I've done for COP26, which is the huge climate change conference in Britain that is happening soon, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, is my contribution to an interdisciplinary creative piece to COP26 Living Language Land project. This project uses words in indigenous languages from around the world to reveal our different ways of relating to land and nature. So I combined my own skills in this particular case as a writer and filmmaker with contributions from a range of different artists and professionals to tell a short but very, very powerful story. It is a unique piece of art that combines all of those different artists that I mentioned, and will be part of a huge exhibition in the UK very shortly, as well as the COP26 Climate Change Conference. So that's just a brief glimpse into what can be done in the arts using different platforms to redress the imbalance and the injustice and the cruelty of the past, and to move towards reparative humanism. Kai Gangans. Thank you, Siyabonga.
Thank you so much. So now we are catching up. And we are going to have the questions now from the audience, from our virtual audience. And I hope that you, Sylvia, and you, Homi, are on standby. So the first one, as it turns out, is for Homi. And Homi, this question is from Makate Sheila. The question is, who teaches humaneness, and at what points in the development in the human child should this teaching occur?
The teaching of the humane is the teaching of consideration, care, hospitality, and security. So the child at home and the child at school learn or should be taught the humane in those institutions, in the family and at school. And I'm, of course, describing a quality of human contact, responsibility, and recognition of others. This, I think, can be taught as an academic discipline by making you read, and in the way in which Pumla talked about it and I described it, identifying with moments of grief or moments of trauma through literature, through philosophy, through the arts. But never forget that everyday life is a challenge to the humane. Microaggressions are not resolvable simply by corrective dogmatic views, but by teaching what it means to be humane. So I think that in a family, the division of responsibilities, the non-dominating sense of dependence, but non-dominating sense of dependence. These are, I think, important ideas of a humane education. And a humane education is not something that that does not involve the public world. It fundamentally involves the public world. And if you look at journalism in the newspapers, one thing I learn again and again is the short memory of the media. A humane media would allow us not only to enter the issue during the crisis, but even if it has to be newsworthy, and I understand that each medium has its own genre, its own rules, but then we need to come back to it. There needs to be continuity so that there is an education, as I put it, an education of the emotions, an education of identification and recognition of others and our responsibilities to them. Therefore, I think for the child, as much as for the grown-up adult, the notion of care and civility is absolutely crucial to a humane world.
So central in these relationships that we are trying to build, the relationships of recognizing the humanity of the other. I want to pose this question. There's a question here by Desiree Barnard about how we bring into unison the positionalities of agent and witness in terms of reconstituting the humane. So how do we bring agent and witness in this conversation about the humane? And I'd like actually both of you, because I'm thinking here about performance arts, and how when there is a performance, on stage, how usually the audience members of the audience identify in different ways with characters. Say for instance, the performance is based on a story from the past. I mean, the story, for example, the experiences of victims who testified at the Truth Commission, and there is a play performance. How do you understand the role, this notion of building a sense of the humane in the context of a theatrical performance? Could you go first, Homi? How might theater bring these roles into dialogue with each other, agent and witness, as part of the...
Well, let me just say that my colleague here is a real practitioner. I'm only blah, 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 blah. I'm a talker. She really works in these areas. So I think she would be much more aware of the issue. But I was using that notion of theatricality, Pumla, because you talked about the arts. Now, if you look at it as from a theoretical and theatrical point of view, first of all, the actor has been given a role, given a part, and the actor has been given a text, and there is a director. And the first form of identification, or a humane identification, has to be made by the actor in relation to the role, using the language of another. This is a very complex situation. I have been reading of a number of actors recently who have played the roles of tyrants, who have played the roles of rabid capitalists, who say, this is not what we are. This is not who we are. And it's not simply that you're so well trained that you can just take on a role which represents views which are completely different from your own. You become the agent very often for us, and this is the perversity, but this is also the learning point. You begin to learn to identify with views that are not your own, that you might find repugnant, in order to communicate those views to an audience so that they will begin to see not that these views are just simply horrible, but in the horror, there is a kind of human or humane palpitation. So I think that in theater, again and again, this, I'm only talking about the actor. If you look at it from the point of view of the viewer, and we think about Bertolt Brecht here and many other great thinkers on the theater, you are pulled to identify with that which is most like you. But the real education comes from being able to see who you are and what in the actor or what in the play reflects your views. And on the other hand, the pull from the other side. Why is it that in Paradise Lost, most students of Milton will tell you that the most attractive character is Satan? Yeah, so again, you have to be agent and witness at the same time. And if you're not agent and witness at the same time, you cannot generate that sense of mutuality. Mutuality begins within you. Mutuality doesn't happen because there is a demographically diverse population. The first lesson of mutuality is to learn your own agonism, your own tension within. So you know that nobody is simply a foreigner to you, because to some extent, when we are hit with various experiences that we expect or we don't, we in certain circumstances become foreigners to ourselves when we have to make the most difficult decisions. So I think, and I could use this to talk about architecture, I could use it to talk about choreography and dance, but the basic idea is simple. Hannah Arendt said, there is always an otherness thrust into my oneness. That was her description of alterity. It's very difficult to accept this. Sometimes that otherness drives you crazy. That's when then it becomes a problem of mental health, where people who are psychotic are ill, very ill, but they are suffering because they see that otherness within themselves, which precludes them from being good parents or good children or good citizens. The more we understand those struggles within ourselves and we don't hide them and repress them, and the more our educational institutions, whether it is the theater program, whether it's a literature program, philosophy program, whether it's a radio program, whether it's on the web, allows us to understand that about ourselves and to care about ourselves, because at some fundamental level we are broken people. We may be broken at times. To care about that is the basis, I think, of the kind of ethics of the witness as the agent.
Yeah, especially because often that otherness within the self is often projected outside to the other, so that whatever, terrible, horrific stuff we fear that is within, it's always the other, it's not the self, and therefore the tendency is to throw it out. And I'm interested in this, and especially in how theater, because I've attended, I was just recently, it's fresh in my mind, the performance by, Basil Apollis. Sorry, I called him Cupido earlier. I made a terrible error. But Basil Apollis performs the story that comes from District 6. And it really, there were people, it was a mixed audience. White people were there as well. What you don't know is there's a woman, as we were I was walking to the car, there was a white woman who was weeping. She says she's weeping, and she says, I'm so moved by this. And she says, it's not even something in this play. I don't know what it is. And stopping with her and talking to her about being moved by this. And so it's moments like that. So what does move her? Something about the story that comes from District 6, with all that District 6 represents, which is not necessarily performed by Basil in the play. And so what is it that in your work, which is so vast and so much connected to these issues that you're talking about, what is it about theater that makes this idea of bringing out what is in the self, the fears, the traumas, the shame? What makes theater, what creates this possibility in a room in a performance theater?
Well, Pumla, there's a famous feminist who talks about the clique of recognition. And so what you're tapping into with that kind of storytelling much more powerfully than in, say, the written form is that moment where we tap into our common humanity, our shared humanity. And no matter how much we are told we are all one and this is just one entity and we exist as these tiny little physical individual sort of beings that is connected to something bigger, when you're told that, it doesn't always sink in. But when you're sitting in the theater or immersed in a beautiful film or watching an amazing piece of dance, the possibility of tapping into the common humanity is so much more vast, because those really quality creative works, they open up doors of perception inside ourselves, and they reduce that crazy notion that we are only ever individual physical beings. And it opens up a world inside ourselves that becomes more easily one and more easily spiritual. And, you know, there's a primary rule in the theater that says, show, don't tell. And so it is kind of frustrating that we don't have examples that we can show in a talk like this, although what is being said here is dynamic, and really I relate to all of it very powerfully. It would have been nice just to have something that we could show of what we're talking about. But I think what is of great concern to me is that when we're talking about the powerful potential of the arts to reconnect us with what is important, with our higher selves, with something bigger, we talk about that and we talk as if we really believe it. But when we are acting in our social lives, in our professional lives, politically, academically, we don't do anything that pays respect to that. The arts in a hierarchical system of things does not occupy a really important status, definitely not at the university where I am. It is a struggle to compete with professors who are doing more theoretical research. When you come along and talk about creative outputs, everybody goes, yeah, that's so nice, yes. But you can see the looks on their faces, and the institution is not built for that. And so politically, the same thing. We are paying lip service to the power of the arts, but in reality, we are killing it.
And you know, what you say now about what is prized at universities is so important in terms of our thinking about curriculum. I mean, everybody talks about decolonizing the curriculum, but these questions, you know, what you just raised is so important, because the role of the arts and the humanities, you know, so to keep it alive, to ensure that it does what it's supposed to do, it's so important to think about these issues. I mean, one of the things, for instance, that came to mind for me is how we think about empathy. You know, what is empathy? It's complicated, of course. I mean, there's good empathy, there's not so good empathy. But when we think about it in terms of connecting to the other, we think about it not only in terms of the brain and the mind, which is what would probably make sense to someone who is doing neuroscience and has become fashionable to do that. What is lost or what is left behind are other experiences of empathy. For instance, Inimba, in the Xhosa language, Inimba, you know, it's something that you feel when you feel connected to the other. You are moved by something. You know, uvakalelwa yinimba, as they say. Ukuvakalelwa yinimba, that is something, that is scholarship in itself. That what is the role of the body, not the body in a neuroscientific sense, but in the body in a relational sense. And I think these are some of the things that are missing in these conversations, because even when we think about trauma, the woundedness of trauma affects the body. And therefore, when we think about repair and the notion of repair, we ought to remember that, you know, you can't talk about the disembodied trauma. It's always, you know, includes, you know, encompasses the whole person. And thinking about these other ways of understanding what it is to connect to the other, for instance, through inimba or Homi. Inimba is literally, that's not quite accurate, umbilical cord, but that's a not very accurate description. Inimba is much more, it's broader than that. It's a feeling that, but in terms of its location, usually it's located behind the navel. But the point about this is that it's a human experience. Inimba, men feel inimba, usually associated with one's own children. You feel uvakalelwa inimba, umntana wakho, when something happens to your child, they may be abroad, you want to make that phone call. And it's amazing. I mean, it's something that you can't explain. Why is it that at the moment you felt you wanted to call, it's something that calls you to the other. So when we are called to the other in this way, through our bodies, through inimba, it's a much broader understanding of what it means to connect to another. And it's something that we ought to incorporate in our thinking as we think about these concepts, to enlarge them. It broadens them, it broadens knowledge itself, and it makes it much more possible to imagine the possibility that you might connect to the other person. I just want to say one last thing, and part of the reason that so many people didn't accept when people said, I forgive someone who's killed my loved one. It's impossible. It sounds like, you can't accept it. But that happens because exactly of these kinds of processes that are inexplicable. Language locks us into a certain kind of languaging of experience. And when we broaden the language and the conversation and the experiences, there is so much more we can say about these experiences, which are limited by language. They say that there are few more questions for Homi from the floor now. Are these from the floor? Or the floor is via the mic? I'm sorry, I got this all wrong. From the floor is via the mic. So someone... Okay, Homi, the Humane has been coming up very much here. I think Noncedo, your question has been answered, I think. Then there is Carla Goldstein. What was the most effective personal practice you used in your own healing that connects the dots between collective and personal trauma?
I think that's a very good question, and it's a very easy, short answer. And it is rediscovering ritual, rediscovering African ritual, going back to traditional healing. And as a person who had been undergoing psychotherapy for many years as a young woman, I found that ditching all of that, throwing it out the window, and going back to a traditional healer of note and looking at African ritual and incorporating that into my life and understanding that, in our universities, for instance, this colonial notion of the disconnect between the soul and the spirit and the mind still abounds. And as Africans, we have struggled against that for centuries. And personally, I realized that internally I was struggling to fit into institutions because I am a deeply spiritual, connected to my ancestors person. And I can't go to work and leave all of that behind. And so reincorporating ritual into my life and understanding that I cannot write anything of note without being a whole person who is connected to my culture, connected to my ancestral heritage, and connected to my unseen world that plays a daily and dynamic part and has a presence in my physical world. Without that, I'm a useless artist and a useless person.
Thank you very much. There is a question from the floor.
Good evening, everybody. I have one question that I would like to ask, and if possible, also share a reflexive response to the conversation. I would like to ask whether there are any flaws in relation to humanism. up until I'm listening to it as a literature student. You go through all the literary and philosophical movements. And one thing that always comes up now for me is the departure from the supernatural that was considered in the 20th century. And I sit with this a lot because in this context in South Africa, you cannot depart from the supernatural because the imagined world is in essence moribund for the indigenous people. I often sit, for example, Buckland talks about the epic, and there are these that Schiller and Goethe talks about, that it needs to have a absolute past, it needs to have a national culture, and you cannot insert yourself in this. But I was thinking, so in a South African context, in an African context, if the imaginings or the imaginings have not been written down, how can one begin to depart from the supernatural in a South African context? And perhaps that in the 20th century, that might be considered a flaw in the humanism, philosophy. Yeah, that's just.
So I would like to take the first question back to you, and perhaps to expand on the idea of the supernatural. What would you like us to understand by
I think
what you're trying to communicate?
If one thinks about the indigenous culture, there is legend, which means that it's something that everyone believes but is not accepted. And that is often what I feel is attached to indigenous culture, so that there's an ambiguity between whether they are real or whether they really existed. And that's because there are no archival other than the drawings on a wall and the language that we don't understand. And then there's also the sort of parody, when Blair came up with these linguistic signs to try and help us to sound the language. And I think in the South African context, so much is the idea of the ancestor, the idea of heritage. For me, plays very much into those things that we cannot understand. But of course, the supernatural here refers to gods and angels. But I don't think that South Africa has had, or Africa has had the opportunity to start thinking about the supernatural that refers to how we believe and how we see ourselves as humans. I think for me, the most violent act is that by the early 20th century, the Kam people and about 80-90% of the people were no longer alive. And so for me, it's like, what caused this? It is absolutely disease, genocide, war. And yet you just look at it that it doesn't exist anymore, but we don't think about the trauma and the violence that these words carry without thinking about it. And so I was just asking if one could consider this as a flaw, and always with Professor Sylvia Vollenhoven's work starts to engage for me with the supernatural that is accepted as a human condition as well, rather than a departure from it.
Yeah, that's very clear. So do you want to respond, Sylvia and Homi?
I would say that it's really made me think listening to Joel, and yes, it is a flaw and we cannot teach the complete fullness, beauty, complexity of what it means to be human if we don't have a complete understanding of human based on the fact that this physical reality we see is a tiny, tiny part of who we are, and that who we are and who we are in all of existence is largely invisible in a physical sense, but is easily accessed in an intuitive sense, in a higher, by our higher intelligence, if we live a certain life and if we ditch certain colonial values that are outdated and highly primitive.
Thank you very much. Homi, may I give you the last word?
But on a topic on which I am quite ignorant, but let me say this, that I think that in the progress of modern society and nationalism, secularism has been institutionalized by various governments, various societies, as a form of modern rationality. Secularism is the kind of liberal secularism in many societies has been seen as part of a progressive social vision. Now, you know, by the definitions we have here, I don't have, as it happens, a sense, that same sense of the ancestral, and I don't have that same sense of ritual, and I'm a hypochondriac who is always looking for medicine of an allopathic kind, so I must confess that. And so I admire that long past that people can carry within themselves. I think that's clearly a very important thing. Now, what worries me, and has got nothing to do with what our what our speaker, whose name I apologize I've forgotten, says, and it's got nothing to do with that. What does worry me is the way in which many, in my country at least, in India, the mythological and the supernatural are being mobilized now for the modern politics of xenophobia and discrimination, marginalization, and even genocide. Or even, I wouldn't say genocide, but for a public violence by the state itself. School textbooks are being written now, which suggests that that there were Indian ideas. First of all, India is a more modern construct, but there thousands of years ago, certain mythological figures had invented the telescope, had invented space travel, had invented that in the, you know, in the 2nd century, people had started doing surgery of various kinds. Now, it doesn't seem to me, and here you might say that I have a rationalist bias, it doesn't seem to me that these ideas are being taught to really explore the supernatural. But it does seem to me that they're being deployed to Hinduize, to use that kind of mythology to create a Hindu nation, which is antithetical to and very exclusionary to minorities, Muslims, etc., amongst others. So you know, it all depends on what you do, I think, in our contemporary world with the supernatural. If it is something that comforts you, if it comforts your community, if you see huge progress by following those ideas, I think, you know, it's a very good thing. But I'm just saying there's the other side of the use of mythology, of ancestry, by a number of people, and some of them are in power and others are not, to create a kind of purist idea of the pure Indian past, the pure Indian mythology, who is really an Indian and who is not, who is really, and that I think is very dangerous. But I think the notion of the supernatural is translatable in other ways. The notion of the unconscious is, if you like, a kind of extra naturalistic phenomenon. Now, it has different rules of belief or interpretation or knowledge. It has different effects, but there are all kinds of such moments. As we know, psychoanalysis started with telepathy. In psychoanalysis, there are, I mean, just to give you an example, there are references to early Greek processes, the Oedipal, the notion of Oedipality, etc. So I'm just saying that, to me, everything that results from the opening up and the great reach of the imagination as it plays out in everyday life is extremely important, so long as its outcomes are open, generous, plural, diverse, deal with alterity, don't shut it out because it belongs to some other supernatural tradition or whatever, and as long as it helps for us to build a world in which there will never be some pure sense of equality or some pure sense of symmetry. But any of these ideas that might help in negotiating the various differences within which we live. I think that what is being said about the supernatural here, if you engaged what I see as a really problematic use of the supernatural in India today, so long as there is the possibility of engagement around any of these ideas, I think it's a very good thing. Where the supernatural itself becomes a sovereignty of understanding and experience, I think it is problematic, just like with anything else. If democracy just claims for itself a sovereignty of political belief and structure, then it's problematic. If secularism suggests that it is the only way of living in the modern world, then it's a problem.
Thank you, Sylvia, for this wonderful conversation together. Thanks to you, audience at home, and thank you, the live audience. We are appreciative to the technical team over there and you over there for this really wonderful setup. I've never been at a webinar that is so professionally done, live and in virtual audience. So we are so grateful to you. Thank you very much. To my own colleagues from Stellenbosch University over there, Randall Adams, who is from the Development and Alumni Office, who's been coordinating with Bailey Coda from the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust, this event. Thank you very much. So all the stuff that I have not been able to name, I'm really very grateful. The people who own this library, the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust itself, we must please give all of these people a round of applause, especially our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you both for including me in your conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.